And then we'll have Karen Wirsig, who's a labor organizer and sometime journalist who lives in Toronto.
So I'm not an academic and I'm not a geographer, and I just thought that Norma insisted that I just be a little intermission here and give some thoughts as a tourist. I wasn't really officially at the conference, and I did go around the West Bank a bit on my own and a bit with a tour group, Tamer's Alternative Tours, which I'll tell you about in a minute, about what it's like to try to move and circulate through the West Bank. For someone with a Jewish or Christian sounding name, who's white and a Canadian passport, you know, the hardest thing is to actually get through the border at Ben Gurion Airport. Like that's the tense thing. And the rest is, you know, then you're basically circulating through the country, and the borders are rather porous, right? Because there's a lot of internal borders, as we see on the map and as you saw in the photos within Israel and Palestine. And some of those borders are concrete. Some of them are, you know, temporary. They're police lines and cars or whatever, and tanks. And some of them are kind of imaginary, but they're all very effective, right? So where we were is, you can see in the pinch point of the country there, just to the right of the Israel sign, is actually Jerusalem. And actually you can see East Jerusalem on that map. It says East Jerusalem if you can read it, but it's a bit blurry. And so that's really the heart of the country, or the heart of two countries, right? It's the heart of the West Bank, it's also the heart of Israel, or at least what would be the heart of Israel, in that sense of Israel. So you can see very clearly that by closing off Jerusalem, you're actually really effectively closing off the northern West Bank from the southern West Bank. It's very hard for people to get around the country. And I had that experience when I went with Tamer. I took a cab from Ramallah to meet Tamer. Turns out he lives in East Jerusalem, but in the part that's on the West Bank side of the wall. He's been cut off from his neighbors by the wall that sort of appeared one day. You know, the blocks were dropped in. The razor wire was put up. Probably a few prison tower-looking things were put up, and that was it. He was cut off from his neighbors. He has no pass for Jerusalem. So this guy, though, all the tourists come from Jerusalem. So this guy has to do some complicated thing when he meets his people, of meeting them at what is probably hell on earth, in my view, the worst hell on earth I've ever seen, which is the Calandia checkpoint, which is a combination of prison tower, actually quarry, like a pit mine of some kind, so really dusty, and these serpentine roads, and you don't exactly know where you are. It's so confusing. You never know where you are in that Calandia checkpoint. What side are you on now? You just know there's probably a gun very close by. But this is a real central. It's the ugliest place you'll ever see, and it's a central meeting place for Palestinians, because for those who can't get into Jerusalem, they are stuck at either going around through the Calandia checkpoint around to the south of the country or the north, or meeting up there. Some people do their shopping. Like it's the weirdest thing I've ever encountered going through that Calandia checkpoint. But of course, for us going to the West Bank, there's nothing. You just take the bus from Jerusalem into Ramallah. The bus doesn't get stopped. At some point, you realize, oh, there's the wall, it's sort of beside you, and then you're on the other side of it, and you're in the West Bank. This is very interesting. And you're on what is I would call the Kingston Road of Ramallah. Almost right away, coming out of the, no, literally, and why I say that is, one of the first things I saw on the left after coming out of hell on earth was an Audi dealership. And that relates a little bit to the pictures you saw of the condos and the new developments, which I must say Ramallah must have a bigger condo boom per capita than Toronto. I'm making that up entirely, like the geographers can correct me, but it really is stunning to see all the construction. And you know it's Palestinian construction because of the water towers. And Kanish didn't explain the significance of those, but those water towers exist because the water is cut off at least weekly. So people need to store water on the roof if they want to maintain water pressure all week. And so this is people living in those fancy, from people living in those fancy condo towers to people living in nice big villa houses that still exist and are being built elsewhere in Ramallah, to people living in the camps, right? And in some of the camps, the water situation is actually much worse, I think, than in some of the cities. But water is a huge issue and a huge human rights issue in the West Bank, and you can see that it's visible everywhere. And we were talking to people like us in academics. I think the woman worked in a bank. They were talking about what summer camps they were sending their kids to. I was talking about what summer camp we were sending our kid to. And then they start telling us about, the water shortages and the fact that once a week they run out of water. I think Stefan told me that Palestinians use less water than anybody in the world. Oh.
It's half the UN minimum, half the UN standard.
Half the UN standard. Like, to us, I mean, imagine. We waste so much water in this country, you can't even imagine. So these are the kinds of limitations that people face, not because of poverty necessarily, although there's obviously a lot of poverty too, but just because they're denied basic access and rights to water. So just the Tamar thing, like Tamar, we had to go and meet this guy around the side of East Jerusalem through the Calandia checkpoint, then back through the Calandia checkpoint to meet the bus. Then we, traveled all through the West Bank and really, at that time, encountered no checkpoints. Like, we weren't stopped the whole time, but he was on Facebook all day trying to figure out where the hot spots were. And he did take us by one road closure right outside the Beit El settlement, the Israeli settlement, where the Supreme Court had deemed two empty buildings were illegal. As the bus driver said, sure, the whole settlement's fine. And this is a massive marble settlement. The whole settlement's fine, but those two ugly gray buildings have to go. So, and they had the Israeli flags up the side. So we actually, the people were protesting and there were fires lit around there and it was going on, but it was actually in the settlement that the protest was happening. That was the only roadblock we encountered the whole time in all of my travels through the West Bank that week. And I have a feeling it's very different this week because, as somebody explained to me, these roadblocks are very easy to put it there. They can be put in place and taken away, by the military very quickly or by the police too. So, I can imagine now that since we've been there, there's all kinds of roadblocks and people's movements are even more impeded than they normally would be. But for that time, there weren't many, and we really circulated around the whole place. But of course, every time there are different roads. So if you don't have Israeli plates, you have to stick to certain roads. If you have Israeli plates, there are other roads you go on. I mean, this is also really interesting. So, and then in some roads, there's mixed traffic, and of course they're the busiest. That's where all the traffic jams are. And I was actually thinking as I was there, this is a little vulnerability, right? For all those people living in the settlements, often to get to work, have to travel on these mixed roads through the occupied territories to get to their jobs. I mean, imagine devoting your life to that. And Tamar's view of that was, he was, he said, sure, there's some political radicals, settlers who do this, but for a lot of people, it's cheap suburban housing. It's affordable because Israel is a very expensive place to live. And so this is cheap suburban housing. So all these people who live in these territories are, going out on these roads every day in what is an occupied territory where other people's movements are limited. Like, you can imagine the juxtaposition was so unbelievable to be stuck in a traffic jam with all these people. Bizarre. Anyway, those are some of my reflections. We met a lot of people. One thing I will say, and I think there's some people here, one of whom we will hear from, Zainab, I think, who was denied entry into Israel itself. Somebody else who was stopped at the border for several hours. We encountered this guy just to show how targeted and how the profiling works. We ran into this guy in Ramallah who's a lawyer. I think he was born, or at least he grew up. He certainly has like a total Southern U.S. accent. South Carolina or something. And he's a lawyer. He works for an NGO in Jerusalem. And he was meeting a friend in Ramallah, so we talked to him for a while. He's like 6'5". He was wearing a seersucker suit, which, if you don't know what that is, I think that's what Colonel Sanders wears. It's a hot summer white suit. So this guy is talking, he sounds like a Southerner, and then he explains that his family now lives in Barcelona, so he has to commute. And every week he comes through Ben Gurion. And we asked him, so what's that like? He goes, I'm usually stopped 4, 6, sometimes 8 hours every time I come through. Why is that? Well, because my name is Fadi. So I don't know if he has Palestinian roots, but his name is clearly, he is picked out of the line every time he comes through. And that's his weekly commute, is like 6, 8 hours in the interrogation room at Ben Gurion Airport. So, this is just how people are kind of expected to live. And you can see, if the third intifada hasn't started yet, what are people waiting for? It's insane. So, there we go. That's it.